there's one thing Texans are known for, it's how they love to brag about their state. Patriotic and plain-spoken, they're proud to be Americans. But maybe even prouder to be Texans. And always ready to tell you why. But who can blame them? They live in the biggest state in the lower 48, a land of amazing contrast and riches, from lush green forests to shimmering towers of steel, to an ancient basin that holds treasure worth billions deep underground. In Texas, miles of pristine coastline curve right up to the horizon. And the sun bakes down on a bone-dry desert that only the bravest dare to cross. Near one of the most heavily guarded border crossings in the world. It's a state that's experienced tragedy and victory up close, where an assassin's bullets shook the nation in a place called Dealey Plaza. And the bloody defeat of a group of Texan rebels at the Alamo inspired a famous battle cry that spurred others on to win the state its freedom. From colony to republic to state, the people of Texas have been standing up for their rights and bragging about it ever since. Here in the Lone Star State. For a state that likes to brag about how big it is, Texas got off to a surprisingly small start in 1822, when an adventurous entrepreneur named Stephen F. Austin led a group of American families to this stretch of the Brazos River and established the first legal American colony in what was then the Mexican state of Tejas. Austin has been casting a long shadow over Texas history ever since. Today, a monument to him, designed by sculptor David Addix, stands tall over Angleton. Mexico welcomed the Americans with 4,400-acre land grants on which to build their new ranches. $30 and loyalty to Mexico was all they had to promise in return. But that quickly changed when Mexico began restricting the rights of the settlers. By the mid-1830s, tensions between the Americans and the Mexicans had reached a fever pitch. On March 2nd, 1836, 58 men from all across the region arrived here at a modest cabin on the Brazos. That little cabin is long gone, but this replica marks the historic site where the Republic of Texas was born. When the men inside signed the Texas Declaration of Independence from Mexico. A declaration that would fuel a war known as the Texas Revolution, which led to one of the most famous battles in American history, at a place Texans will always remember, the Alamo. This former Catholic mission is surrounded by downtown San Antonio and is besieged today only by tourists. But in March of 1836, a band of almost 200 Texan rebels were barricaded inside the Alamo, including legendary frontiersmen William Travis, Davy Crockett, and Jim Bowie. Outside, they were surrounded by an army of more than 1,800 Mexicans under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who was also the president of Mexico. Santa Anna ordered the Texans to surrender on pain of death, setting the stage for a tragedy that reached its final act on March 6th, when the Mexicans moved in. The outnumbered men in the Alamo fought heroically, but were quickly overwhelmed. Those who didn't die in battle were executed, just as Santa Anna had promised. Ever since that day, cries of "Remember the Alamo" have filled the Texas air. But the Texas Revolution wasn't over yet. Just outside modern-day Houston lies San Jacinto, the historic site where Texas's independence was finally won. Today, the Battle of San Jacinto Monument marks the spot where on April 21st, 1836, the rebel army got its revenge. Led by General Sam Houston, they too were outnumbered, but managed to outfox and outfight the Mexicans and even capture Santa Anna himself. The Mexican president had no choice but to surrender, finally giving Texas its independence. The new Republic of Texas was its own country for almost 10 years. Sam Houston, the hero of the revolution, was elected the Republic's first president. But no one could agree on where Texas officials should call their home. In 1839, a small town on the Colorado River named Waterloo was chosen and renamed in Stephen F. Austin's honor. Today, it's a glimmering jewel in the Texas crown, home to the impressive Texas state capitol. Continued hostility with Mexico finally drove Texans to accept an offer to join the United States as the 28th state in 1845. But it wasn't until March 2nd, 1885, that the cornerstone was laid for the new capital, for a proud civic palace to honor America's largest state at the time, since Alaska wasn't yet part of the U.S. It was built on one of Austin's highest points, with a foundation of Texas limestone, walls of red Texas granite, and an imposing dome designed to be taller than the one in Washington, D.C. So Texans would have one more reason to brag, capped by a 16-foot statue of the Goddess of Liberty holding the Texas Star. It cost almost $4 million to build, which would be more than $90 million today, a bill paid mostly in land instead of cash. When the building opened in 1888, Texans poured in to take a look and have been bragging about how nice it turned out ever since. When legislators needed more room in the early 1990s, the project's architects left the original building untouched and buried their addition out back and gave it an impressive light well that looks, from the air, like a mirror image of the Capitol Dome. Today, the Capitol still stands in Austin as a grand and dignified symbol of a proud state. But the city that surrounds it often has a very different vibe. In fact, some of the locals like to brag that it's downright weird, especially the blocks around historic 6th Street. In the 1960s, this was the heart of Austin's Skid Row. Then in the 70s, a few daring Austinites began promoting live music in its dive bars. 6th Street became the center of a vital new music scene, inspired by the legacies of Texas musical greats like Buddy Holly, Roy Orbison, and Willie Nelson. Thanks in large part to students from another Austin landmark, the University of Texas. UT opened in 1883 with just one unfinished building and 221 students. Today, there are 52,000. Former students include Lady Bird Johnson, computer entrepreneur Michael Dell, singer Janis Joplin, and actors Owen Wilson and Matthew McConaughey. On fall Saturday afternoons, up to 100,000 fans crowd into Memorial Stadium to see the legendary Texas Longhorns play football and chant one of the shortest chants in college sports, Texas fight. The Longhorns have given Texas football fans plenty to brag about over the years and given UT students plenty of great memories of campus life. But for many graduates in the late 1960s, their memories of UT were colored less by football and more by the horrific events of a single day in August. Events that unfolded here on the campus's central plaza. Soaring above it, a 307-foot-high clock tower once served as an inspiring beacon for generations of students after it opened in 1937. But that changed on August 1st, 1966. At roughly 11:48 a.m., a student walking across the plaza below suddenly cried out and fell to the ground. Her friend and a nearby physics professor fell next, all hit by bullets that seemed to come from nowhere. More followed, striking students and others across the campus and on a busy street nearby. Victims of sniper fire from an unhinged ex-Marine named Charles Whitman, who had barricaded himself on the tower's observation deck with an arsenal of weapons. Police and well-armed Austinites fired back. Some of the hundreds of bullet holes they left behind can still be seen in the tower's facade. Whitman took cover behind the parapet and continued firing through the waterspouts. By the time the police finally managed to make it up to the observation deck and take him out, he'd shot 14 people dead and injured dozens more. Today, visitors to the tower have to pass through a metal detector to make sure they're not carrying any guns, which makes the UT Tower one of the few places outside of an airport where Texans are forbidden to pack heat. Much of the land that's now present-day Texas was once part of colonial Mexico, which was also known as New Spain. And the only thing that stood in the way of travelers then was a river called the Rio Grande. Today, the Texas border is one of the most secure in the world, especially here in El Paso. A team from U.S. Customs and Border Protection keeps an eye out for suspicious activity below. The international crossing he's guarding is the second busiest in the U.S., even though it's one of the most remote. From the capital in Austin, it lies 600 miles to the west in the barren desert along the Rio Grande River. Here, the U.S.-Mexico border follows the route of the river and is home to the city of El Paso. Spanish explorers named the area El Paso del Norte in the 16th century after a convenient mountain pass on the way to the north. For centuries, the town along the river catered to the north-south traffic that came in the explorers' wake. Then, the Mexican-American War and a new border split the community in two. The American side was reborn as El Paso, the Mexican as Juarez. With not much around them, both towns were highly dependent on the other. But in recent years, after drug wars turned Juarez into one of the world's murder capitals, U.S. Customs and Border Protection ramped up its efforts to keep the troubles from spilling over to the American side. The trick was to do it without halting the cross-border traffic that is vital to both countries' economies. A mix of old-fashioned vigilance, walls, high-tech tools, canine patrols, and helicopters get the job done, leaving no inch of the border that winds along the Rio Grande here in El Paso unsecured. But that's not the case everywhere on the Texas-Mexico border. Downriver from El Paso, the Rio Grande wanders alone through a wild desert landscape with no one to stand guard, and no walls around it but the steep sides of beautiful Santa Elena Canyon. Those who try to cross in remote areas like this may have less of a chance of encountering border agents than in El Paso, but all too many meet their end from snakebite, exposure, or bandits instead. It's why many attempt to cross here in El Paso, even though they face a higher chance of getting caught. Risking everything in search of a better life, just as folks have been doing here in Texas from the very start. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors managed to cross the Rio Grande in their search for cities of gold. Over the next 2 centuries, they conquered this arid land in the name of their king and built a string of beautiful missions to lure its native people to their god. Some of these settlements went on to become the Texas towns and cities we know today. That's how modern San Antonio got its start. Thanks to the San Jose y San Miguel de Igual mission, which lies just a stone's throw from downtown. In 1720, this mission was little more than a tiny compound. But over the next 50 years, the Franciscans built this imposing church with its soaring bell tower and Baroque entryway. It was soon famous across the New World as the Queen of the Missions. From 1749 to 1821, the nearby settlement of San Antonio gradually developed into a vital colonial crossroads. Today, almost 200 years later, the city's unique mix of Latin and Anglo culture still gives it a Tex-Mex flavor all its own. But San Antonio wouldn't be what it is today without the vision of a local architect named Robert Hugman. In the 1920s, after the San Antonio River flooded downtown, the city decided to divert the river and build a covered storm channel through town instead. But Hugman had a different idea: to convert that channel into a beautifully landscaped refuge from the Texas heat. Today, this 2.5-mile stretch is known as the Riverwalk. But there's one important place in town that the Riverwalk doesn't reach: the home of the NBA's San Antonio Spurs. When the Spurs arrived here in 1973, the people of San Antonio finally had a Major League sports team to call their own. But it took almost 3 decades for the team to get its own stadium. In 1999, the Spurs' first victory in the NBA championships finally inspired San Antonio to give them a home. After it opened in 2002, the team rewarded San Antonio with 3 more NBA titles in 2003, 2005, and 2007, giving their fans plenty to cheer about. In a surprisingly cosmopolitan city that was once a remote Spanish outpost. There's a place in Texas where the American West seems to begin. A place where the vast, monotonous prairie that sweeps in from the east comes to a sudden end at the edge of a deep chasm. And mysterious towers called hoodoos stand guard at the entry to a strange land. This is Palo Duro Canyon. For 90 million years, the prairie dog town fork of the Red River and the Texas weather have worked together to carve this canyon from the prairie soil, exposing colorful bands of sedimentary rock deposited here over 240 million years ago, leaving behind a technicolor landscape that seems custom-made to serve as the backdrop to a Hollywood Western. Beyond Palo Duro Canyon, the west of legend and lore, stretches across thousands of square miles of Texas and all the way back to frontier days. Days of guns and blood, when American settlers began pouring into the new state and driving the Cherokee, Comanche, Caddo, and other native people who lived here off their ancient lands. When these tribes fought back, the U.S. cavalry sent some unusual troops to help the settlers out. They came here to Fort Davis in far west Texas. The fort was founded in 1854, but was abandoned during the Civil War. Native Americans later used the wood of its buildings for fuel. But after the Civil War, in 1867, the U.S. cavalry returned and began rebuilding the fort. With new officers' quarters, a new hospital, and new barracks to house a new type of soldier. African-American volunteers, the Indians called the Buffalo Soldiers. For 20 years, the Buffalo Soldiers at Fort Davis blazed trails for African Americans as the U.S. Army's first peacetime regiments of black troops. They played a key role in America's western expansion by helping to build the roads settlers needed and protecting them from Indian attacks. By the late 1880s, the settlers had pushed the Indians all the way out. Fort Davis was abandoned again when the black soldiers were sent on, leaving behind the new Texas they had helped to create. A Texas of ranches, cattle, and cowboys that would become famous around the world. Though the cowboys weren't the first to ranch here. The Texas-style ranches we know today got their start as Spanish or Mexican ranches before the American Revolution. Like this one, King Ranch, the largest in Texas. In 1853, a New York steamboat pilot named Richard King and his partner, Gideon K. Lewis, bought this ranch on an old Spanish land grant and combined it with other property. Today, it's still going strong and still owned by King's heirs. At its heart stands the Big House. With strutting peacocks, teak floors, and Tiffany furnishings, this mansion is the stuff of Texas legend, even though almost no one except the family is allowed inside. Outside, the cowboys known as Quineños, or the King's Men, live in more humble quarters. They manage more than 50,000 head of cattle and help generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for the ranch, which now also makes money by putting its name on branded shotguns and pickup trucks. Creating a revenue stream Richard King could never have imagined. Back then, to make money from their cattle, ranchers like King had to round them up and drive them hundreds of miles north on horseback. They followed a series of dirt tracks, which were together known as the Chisholm Trail, that started around San Antonio, headed up through Oklahoma, and all the way to the towns of Ellsworth and Abilene in Kansas, where trains were ready to transport the cattle to slaughterhouses in the big cities like Chicago and San Francisco. As the cattle drives headed north, Texas businessmen here in Waco found a way to cash in. They built a bridge over the Brazos River to make it easy for the cows and cowboys to cross, and then charged a toll for every man and every cow. When it opened in 1870, it was the longest suspension bridge west of the Mississippi. It would earn the men who built it $25,000 a year in tolls, a phenomenal amount in those days, and spark a boom in Waco by bringing the cattle drives right through town. This appealing little city, home to Baylor University, the birthplace of Dr. Pepper, and the Texas Rangers Museum, has been riding out booms and busts ever since. Texans no longer have to drive their cattle to Kansas. But being a cowboy is still a way of life across the Lone Star State, as it is here at the 43,000-acre Circle Bar Ranch outside Truscott. Today, cowboys from nearby ranches are helping Circle Bar's Colton Daniel gather his cattle. They've been on horseback since the crack of dawn, and will be riding the range right up until the sun goes down. Colton's family has been ranching in Texas since the 1800s. But a lot has changed since then. These days, Colton uses his cell phone to coordinate a hunt for missing cows. But even with newfangled gadgets, it still takes hard work to be a Texas cowboy. Work that's created the iconic image of the Texan in his Stetson, riding on the range. And no one did more to make the image of the Texan in his cowboy hat famous around the world than a hill country rancher who also happened to be the leader of the free world, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Born and bred in Central Texas, Johnson called this ranch along the Pedernales River, west of Austin, home. Just weeks after assuming office, Johnson and his wife Lady Bird charmed the world and West German Chancellor Ludwig Erhard by holding their first state dinner here at their ranch and turning it into a state barbecue. They often jetted into a specially built runway on this downsized version of Air Force One. Press reports of their comings and goings kept the Texas ranch lifestyle in the global spotlight and led many to assume the ranch was Johnson's childhood home. But LBJ actually grew up nearby, in this modest home, as a member of a less successful branch of the family that gave nearby Johnson City its name. The son of a local politician who failed a re-election bid, he went to school in this one-room schoolhouse and vowed to make good where his daddy had not. When LBJ purchased this ranch from his aunt in 1951, it was proof he had made the grade. Today, it is preserved much as he and Lady Bird left it, including the graveyard, where they are buried together in their beloved Texas soil. But beyond its fences, the state they knew so well, the rural Texas of back roads and small towns, of cowboys and cattle, has changed in ways they could never have imagined. When the sun rises over western Texas, it can seem like another world. A prehistoric land where ancient creatures once roamed. Texas has some of the most desolate landscape in the lower 48, including miles of forbidding desert on its western fringe. But surprisingly, the Lone Star State is not as lonely as it might first seem. In fact, there are more people per square mile in Texas than in more than 20 other states, including Alabama, Vermont, and Nevada. And even in the most remote places, Texans have managed to create new life where there was none before. On an ancient bone-dry salt bed, alfalfa manages to thrive thanks to a hidden supply of water pumped from an aquifer onto these giant pivot point irrigation circles. But there are other, even stranger signs of life in this seemingly barren Texas landscape. Like this, a city storefront in the middle of nowhere. This lonely Prada boutique isn't a mirage, but it's also not a real store. It's a work of art by Berlin-based artists Michael Elmgreen and Ingard Dragset. They call it pop architectural land art and plan to let it sit here on this remote stretch of US Highway 90 and decay until it turns to dust. In a sort of slow-motion critique of America's consumerist culture. Artists from around the world may be finding inspiration in the barren West Texas desert, but Texans themselves flock to much cooler landscapes, whenever they can. 25% of all Texans live within a short drive from one of the longest coastlines in America. 367 miles in all, stretching from Mexico to Louisiana. But the state's most stunning beaches aren't actually on the coast. They're on a series of barrier islands just offshore, mile after mile of dunes, surf, and sand. The most popular by far is Padre Island National Seashore, the longest undeveloped barrier island in the world. Texans come here to escape the pressures of modern life and enjoy a wild side of Texas. Behind these dunes, marshes and lagoons teem with animal and plant life, including some endangered species. But these islands are vital to humans too. When hurricanes rage across the Gulf, these long, narrow islands absorb the brunt of the storm, protecting the coastal towns that lie on the Texas mainland. Which is why the men who founded Galveston on one of the islands in the 1830s were taking a gamble from the start. They were betting its oceanfront location would turn their new city into a thriving port. And for a while, their risky wagers seemed to pay off. The new port city boomed. Elegant homes soon lined Galveston's streets, like Ashton Villa, built by New York hardware merchant James Morrow Brown, the first brick house in Texas. Its wrought iron veranda is said to have been shipped in from Philadelphia. That veranda earned the house a special place in the history books on June 19, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger stepped out on the balcony and read to a crowd below the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves. Blacks in Texas and across the country have been celebrating June 19th or Juneteenth as a day of liberation ever since. By the 1880s, Galveston had become the biggest city in Texas and one of the wealthiest in the nation, thanks to its bustling cotton trade. Its impressive architecture stands today as a proud symbol of that self-confident time. But pride, as they say, comes before a fall. On September 8, 1900, one of the deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history, even more devastating than Katrina, slammed into this island city head-on, with winds of more than 120 miles per hour. It destroyed a third of Galveston's buildings and killed close to 8,000 people. Many believed Galveston was finished. But even though the city fathers erected a 17-foot seawall to protect the city from future storms, Galveston's golden age never returned. Thanks mostly to an ambitious neighbor to the north, a growing city named Houston. Houston was founded in 1836 by John and Augustus Allen, who named it for Sam Houston, the first president of the new Republic of Texas, which had just won its independence. The two brothers bragged its location on the shores of Buffalo Bayou, north of Galveston, would make it the greatest port in Texas. But it wasn't until 1913, when the bayou was finally dredged to create the Houston Shipping Channel, that their claims proved true. The channel brought ocean-going vessels inland to Houston's new ports and turned Galveston into a backwater. Today, billions of dollars of crude pass through this waterway. To make room for ever larger cargo ships and tankers, the Fred Hartman Bridge was constructed in 1995, with roadways suspended 178 feet in the air. A new Texas landmark, the bridge guards the entrance to the fourth largest city in the U.S. The gleaming modern metropolis of Houston, known as the energy capital of the world. And home to another jewel in the Lone Star State's crown, NASA's Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center. Since 1964, most NASA space missions have been guided from these control rooms, including the Apollo 13 flight in 1970 that made "Houston, we've had a problem" a catchphrase around the world. The cool-headed NASA staff helped prevent disaster on that famous flight, proving that years of training and preparation pay off, just as they do when disaster erupts back here on the ground. As a center of the world's petrochemical industry, Texas is home to thousands of potentially volatile sites. Just outside Houston stands the largest refinery in the U.S., run by ExxonMobil. Over 4,000 people work in its 2,500-acre web of pipes and structures, refining more than 550,000 barrels of oil a day. It's one of hundreds of large industrial sites all across the state. One accidental leak or spark, and industrial facilities like these can erupt in balls of flame. That's what happened at a fertilizer plant on April 17, 2013, in the town of West Texas. 200 people were injured, 15 were killed, including 11 firefighters and first responders. Today, a few of their brethren have come here to the Brayton Fire Training Field outside College Station to get the skills and training they need to avoid meeting the same fate. Brayton opened in 1960 as part of the Texas A&M University Fire School and added this $70 million annex called Disaster City in 1998. Crashed planes, overturned tankers, train wrecks. Disaster City has them all. Plus a wide range of mocked-up industrial sites that can combust on command. These simulated catastrophes are designed to prepare teams of firefighters and first responders from Texas, the U.S., and around the world to face the real thing. But there was one giant explosion in Texas in 1901 that no one was quite prepared for. An eruption that would lead to the biggest boom in Texas history, and one that continues to this day. It happened just outside Beaumont, near the Texas border with Louisiana, when an exploratory oil well called Spindletop exploded in a gusher 100 feet high. Today, this recreated Spindletop uses a gusher of water to give a sense of what it was like. By the time the well was finally capped, 9 days later, it was standing in a vast pool of oil, and a new Texas industry had been born. No place in Texas was more transformed by that first oil boom than the town of Kilgore, which sat right on top of one of the world's great oil reserves. Within weeks, its 500 residents had lots of new neighbors, oil derricks. Almost 1,200 derricks like these started popping up downtown, around an area that Texans started calling the world's richest acre. One well was even drilled through the elegant terrazzo floor of the bank it replaced. And another sprouted right in what's now Kilgore High School's front yard. Kilgore's major oil boom lasted less than 30 years. By the 1960s, most of the oil had been pumped out. By then, Texans had gone looking for more oil to exploit and found it far to the west of Kilgore. It's a landscape unlike any other in the U.S. Millions of acres of former desert transformed by the search for a treasure that lies deep underground, in a place known as the Permian Basin. Here, pump jacks stretch to the horizon and work 24/7 to pump oil and natural gas to the surface. Dig a well just about anywhere here, and it's bound to strike gold. That's because this 75,000 square mile basin was once the floor of a prehistoric sea, whose animal and plant life created vast reserves of petroleum over millions of years. First exploited in the 1920s, up to 40 billion barrels of oil have been pumped from the ground here since commercial production began. A hidden labyrinth of underground pipelines carry the crude to market. Sometimes old pipelines pop to the surface, as they do here in the Monahans Sandhills State Park. Evidence of America's complex web of buried oil infrastructure that most of us never see. The first oil boom in the Permian went bust in the 1980s, thanks to a glut of oil on the global market. By 2010, the boom times were back, thanks in large part to new, often controversial hydraulic fracturing techniques that allow energy companies to re-drill these fields all over again and create billions of dollars of revenue from a region many had written off. It was during the area's first boom that an oil man named George Bush Sr. moved with his wife Barbara to the town of Midland. In this modest house, they raised their sons, Jeb and George W. It was oil from the Permian Basin that made Bush a millionaire before he ran for political office. Their former home is now a museum. On fall Fridays, many of the region's oil workers and their families head to nearby Odessa, home to Ratliff Stadium and its Permian Panthers. In West Texas, high school football is like a state religion that holds its services on Friday nights. And for many here, Ratliff Stadium is the Vatican. Up to 18,000 fans show up to cheer the Panthers on. They aren't the only ones who've come calling. Hollywood has too. First, the team inspired a best-selling book about the 1988 season. Then, the book inspired a hit movie in 2004 and an award-winning TV series in 2006. Both the book and the movie featured kids from families that never got rich in the region's oil booms. Perhaps because those who did often left West Texas behind, heading east to find a place where they could spend their new money in style. Dallas. Big D, as it's also known, has been famous for its flashy millionaires ever since. Known around the world as a town where sass and cash go together, as they do here at Dallas Cowboys Stadium, in a really big way. Billionaire team owner Jerry Jones likes to brag that the $1.2 billion stadium is the right size for Texas, at 3 million square feet, with a massive retractable roof and 120-foot-high end zone doors that are the largest operable glass doors in the world. When it opened, critics sniffed that Jones had gone too far. But many Dallas fans think his flashy Texas-sized stadium is just grand. Though they'd probably like it even better if it wasn't actually in Arlington, a 20-mile drive to the west. Still, the stadium's not the only famous symbol of Dallas that isn't actually in town. One of the most notorious lies 30 miles to the north in a place called Allen, but still says Dallas to the world. From 1978 to 1991, this house stood in for South Fork, home to the Ewings, the feuding fictional family on the hit nighttime soap opera Dallas. For 357 episodes, the Ewings schemed, deceived, lusted, and murdered here. Acting out a fantasy of Texas millionaire greed and bad behavior that fans seem to accept as an accurate portrait of life among the Dallas elite. Even though most of the episodes were filmed in Los Angeles. In the end, even folks in Dallas came to love the show and embraced the image of millionaires gone wild it broadcast to the world, hoping perhaps that it might eclipse another darker image of Dallas, an image created during one of the darkest chapters in American history. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at 11:40 a.m. Central Standard Time, Air Force One set down here at Dallas Love Field with President John F. Kennedy and his wife Jackie on board. Some of JFK's advisors had warned them not to come. They said the liberal Kennedy was hated in conservative Dallas and wouldn't be safe. But Kennedy was sure he could win Dallas over with the help of his charming wife. 15 minutes after their plane touched down, they were in a motorcade on their way to the Dallas Trade Mart for a fence-mending lunch with local Democrats. Along a winding route that brought the motorcade straight down Main Street, over to Elm Street, and here to Dealey Plaza, in front of the Texas School Book Depository Building at 12:29 p.m. 1 minute later, as the president's slow-moving convertible limo reached the spot marked today by a small white X in the roadway, shots rang out. Kennedy and fellow passenger Texas Governor John Connally were both hit. Within seconds, their blood-spattered car was speeding west on Elm and onto the Stemmons Freeway. As it turned to race north, doctors at nearby Parkland Hospital learned that the badly injured Kennedy was on his way. Minutes later, the president's limo was at Parkland's emergency room door. Shocked Americans quickly learned that their charismatic president had been shot. Then, at 1:36 p.m., they heard the tragic news. The president was dead. 30 minutes later, over the protests of the Dallas Medical Examiner and the doctors, and in violation of Texas state law, Secret Service agents removed his body and returned it to Air Force One. At 2:47, with JFK's casket and a new president on board, the jet took off again from Love Field. It had been on the ground for just over 3 hours. By then, Lee Harvey Oswald, the young Texan officials would blame for the crime, was already in custody for killing a cop. By the next day, he had been charged with Kennedy's murder. Oswald's own murder, just 2 days later, kept the world from hearing what he had to say in his own defense. Conspiracy theorists have been arguing about what really happened that tragic day in Dealey Plaza ever since. But Dallasites were certain the assassination would stain their city forever, no matter who was to blame. In their grief, they hired noted architect Philip Johnson to build a memorial to the fallen president. He responded with this simple yet eloquent room, walled off from the city, but open to the Texas sky. A solemn space to pause and remember a great man, and a tragic day neither Texas nor America will ever forget. The truth about what happened that day in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963 may never be known. But that hasn't kept curious Texans from finding other mysteries to solve, even if it requires a journey to a remote corner of the Lone Star State. High on this West Texas mountain stands a powerful modern tool for unlocking the secrets of the universe. This is the Hobby Eberly Telescope, part of the University of Texas's McDonald Observatory. Its 433-inch mirror is one of the largest in the world. It uses spectroscopy, the decoding of light, to analyze the properties of stars, galaxies, and all the vast spaces in between. It made its first major discovery in 1999, when it revealed the existence of a quasar so far away that the light we see from it today began traveling toward Earth 10 billion years ago. Since then, the telescope has been used to find planets around distant stars, track supernovas, measure the mass of vast black holes, and seek the answer to why gravity exists. big questions, getting big answers on top of this windy West Texas peak. Thanks to a high-tech marvel that's given Texans one more reason to feel proud. And one more reason to brag about their urban, rural, friendly, rugged, high-tech, old-fashioned, truly great Lone Star State.